Rome, 101 BC. The Cestius Bridge stretches over the dark throat of the Tiber, stone upon stone, cold as judgment. The river below does not hurry. It only breathes. Heavy. Slow, as if it has swallowed too many secrets to ever speak again. On the bridge, a man is on his knees. He's naked. Not out of ritual, out of stripping. Stripped of cloth, of name, of dignity, until there is nothing left but skin and trembling bone. The night air bites him. The stone beneath him steals what little warmth remains. His teeth chatter in thin, helpless clicks. He has done a thing Rome cannot forgive. He has killed his mother. And now Rome answers. Not with a blade that ends quickly. Not with a mercy that closes the eyes and calls it justice. No. Rome prefers something slower. Something that teaches. A leather sack is dragged forward across the bridge. It rasps against the stone. Scrape. Scrape. A sound like a coffin being pulled from the earth. But the sack is not empty. Inside it, something moves. A cramped, furious life. Clawing, thrashing, hissing. A knot of animals forced into the same darkness. A dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a viper. All alive, all panicked, all turning upon one another in blind terror. The man sees the sack, and whatever strength remains in him tries to crawl backward. His palms skid on damp stone. His breath breaks into ragged animal gasps. He opens his mouth to plead, and Rome gives him rods. Not clean wood, not pale staffs, but blood-red rods, as if they have already been dipped in what they are about to summon. The blows begin without ceremony. Flesh yields with a wet, ugly sound. The bridge fills with the rhythm of it, thud, 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 until his back is no longer a back, but a ruined cloth of torn skin. Then the sack is opened wider. The air that spills out is rank, hot animal breath, fear, and something sharp, like iron. Hands seize him. They do not lift him as a man, they shove him as refuse. He screams when his raw back touches the leather. He screams again when the dog snaps, when the rooster flails its spurs, when the monkey scrabbles over him, finding purchase in his wounds, when the viper coils, silent, precise, and strikes. One bite, then another. A needle of venom sliding into muscle already convulsing with terror. He thrashes, but there is nowhere to go. The sack is a world with no horizon, no corner, no escape. Only teeth and claws and frantic bodies colliding in the same suffocating prison. And then, the sewing begins. Thick thread, rough hands. The mouth of the sack is pulled shut while he is still screaming, while he is still alive enough to understand what it means to be sealed away from the world. The sound changes. The scream becomes muffled, distant, like a voice being buried. The sack is cinched tight and lifted. For a heartbeat, there is only the night wind over the river and the weight of what is about to happen. Then, a heave, and the sack goes over the edge. It hits the water with a heavy splosh, and the river swallows it whole. No sky, no sun, no air that belongs to the living, no earth waiting to receive the body. Only water closing in, and leather holding fast. And inside, a knot of life turned into a weapon. This, Cicero would later explain, was the point. Let him be denied sky, sun, water, and earth. Let the one who killed the giver of life be severed from the very things life itself comes from. And even the animals were not chosen at random. The dog, shamelessness. The rooster, arrogance. The monkey, malice. The viper, venomous hatred. The poison he carried toward his own blood. His body would not be buried. His soul would not be allowed peace. Rome had a name for it. Poena, the punishment of the sack. And no, this is not a story invented to frighten children. It appears in the 12 Tables, Rome's oldest legal code, reaching back to 450 BC, a line of law carved so deep into the Roman mind that even centuries could not soften it. But listen carefully, because the sack was only the beginning. What Rome perfected was not merely death, it was message. A language written in bruises, in screams, in silence, in the way a crowd learns to breathe calmly while a human being is unmade. Not the arena you already know, not the gladiator and the roar and the sand. This is what Rome did outside the Colosseum, when the purpose was not spectacle alone, but obedience. And the question is not whether Rome could kill. The question is why Rome refused to let killing be simple. Why did it need the ritual, the symbols, the slow cruelty that lingered in the mind long after the body was gone? Because in Rome, death was never only an ending. It was a warning that had to be unforgettable. The Romans like to call it law, but law in Rome was never only about weighing guilt and innocence. It was about shaping the soul of the crowd, teaching citizens what to fear, what to worship, what to never even think of becoming. That is why a quick death was considered incomplete. A clean blade ends a life, yes, but it does not leave a stain in the imagination. Rome needed stains. Rome needed images that followed you home. Seneca, who watched these punishments with his own eyes, understood what they truly did to a human being. He admitted that after witnessing executions, he returned home feeling harsher, hungrier, less human. Not because he had been among beasts, but because he had been among men. This was not justice. This was propaganda written in flesh. And nowhere was that more visible than the place Rome chose for traitors to die. Not outside the city, not hidden behind walls, but at the very center of Roman life, so close to power that even the stones could hear the screams. There was a cliff in the heart of Rome, a jagged edge of rock rising above the city like a broken tooth. They called it the Tarpeian Rock. It stood on the southern summit of the Capitoline Hill, looking down over the Roman Forum, the beating civic heart where senators argued and citizens gathered, where laws were proclaimed and alliances were made. And from that height, roughly 80 feet, a body does not simply fall. It is thrown. It is cast out, as if the city itself is vomiting you. The air up there is thin and cold. Wind skates along the stone and carries every sound downward. When someone screamed at the edge, the forum below could hear it. Senators, merchants, soldiers, mothers with children in their arms. Everyone would look up. Everyone would see. The rock was named for Tarpeia, a young woman from Rome's earliest days, remembered not for how she lived, but for how betrayal ended her. The old story says she opened Rome's gates to the Sabines, tempted by a promise. She wanted what the soldiers wore on their arms, golden bracelets, bright as the sun on polished metal. But when the Sabines entered, they did not pay her in gold. They paid her in weight. They crushed her beneath their shields, layer upon layer, until she disappeared under the very protection she tried to steal. Rome learned early. Treachery is not rewarded. It is buried. And from that moment, the Tarpeian Rock became a kind of altar, where betrayal was offered up to the city as warning. The procedure was brutally simple. A condemned Roman, someone who had betrayed the state, would be led through the streets toward the cliff. Not hurried, not hidden. Led slowly enough for the rumor to spread, for faces to gather, for the forum to swell with bodies. At the edge, there were no speeches meant to comfort, no gentle prayers. Rome did not soothe traitors. They were thrown. No rope, no chance to brace. Just the violent shove, the sudden absence of ground. And then, the awful, silent moment in the air when the body realizes it has become nothing but falling. Below, the rocks waited like jaws. And when the body hit, the sound was not heroic. It was wet. Final. A dull crack swallowed by the gasp of the crowd. The corpse was left where it fell, broken in public view, so that every Roman who crossed the Forum would see what waited for those who reached for power the wrong way. Denied burial, denied the peace of the afterlife, denied even the dignity of being hidden beneath earth. The historian Livy records that in 384 BC, one of the most famous victims was Marcus Manlius Capitolinus. Once a hero, once the man who had saved Rome during a Gallic attack, and yet, later, accused of aspiring to kingship. In a republic that feared kings like a plague, ambition itself could be framed as betrayal. So Rome did what Rome always did. It turned a political message into a death the city could not forget. Marcus Manlius was taken to that cliff above the Forum and hurled, a hero turned into a warning, not merely killed, cast out. And over the centuries, bodies accumulated below that rock like a grim harvest. So many remains, so many shattered bones, that the area reportedly had to be cleared from time to time. Death making clutter of the very heart of Rome. Even emperors came to watch. It is said that Claudius attended these executions, not as a distant ruler, signing orders from marble halls, but as a spectator, standing close enough to see the angle of impact, the way a spine bends when it meets stone. Seneca described, with disgust, the kind of perverse curiosity that could make a man look at ruined bodies and feel not horror, but interest. For Roman citizens who betrayed their own, the Tarpeian Rock was the end. Quick, but symbolic. A sentence carved into the skyline. But Rome's cruelty had layers, and not everyone received the same kind of death. For slaves, for foreigners, for rebels, for those Rome decided were beneath dignity, the city devised something slower. Something that did not end at the moment of impact. Something that turned the body into a long, public lesson. Crucifixion. Even the word feels like splintered wood in the mouth. Rome considered it so brutal, so degrading, that Roman citizens were legally exempt from it. It was reserved for those the empire wanted to break, not only physically, but socially. A death meant to say, "You are not one of us. You will not be mourned. You will be displayed." And before the cross ever rose, it began with stripping, with scourging, with whips threaded with bone and metal, tearing skin into ribbons until the back became unrecognizable, until the victim could no longer tell whether the wetness running down their body was sweat or blood, or both. Then, when the legs barely held, Rome made them carry the crossbeam, the patibulum, through the streets, step by step, under jeers, under spit, under the eyes of people who wanted to feel safe and were willing to watch someone else be destroyed to buy that feeling. And as the condemned stumbled forward, half blind with pain, tasting iron on their tongue, Rome's message was already working. Because everyone who saw that procession understood one thing with perfect clarity. Rome did not merely kill its enemies. Rome educated them in suffering and used their bodies to educate everyone else. At the execution site, the air always smelled the same. Dust, sweat, old blood dried into the grain of wood, and beneath it all, a faint, sour odor that came from fear held too long inside the body. The condemned was brought forward, staggering, half carried, because the scourging had already done its work. Skin hung loose, shoulders shook uncontrollably. Sometimes the victim's feet left thin, dark prints on the ground, little signatures of pain that vanished as the crowd pressed closer. Then the crossbeam, the patibulum, was set behind the neck and across the shoulders. It was not merely weight, it was humiliation made physical. They forced the condemned to carry it through the streets so that Rome could look upon the body before it was destroyed, so that the city could watch a human being become less than human, step by step, under the sun or under cloud, depending on the day, but always under eyes that did not turn away. Some collapsed. The knees would fold suddenly, as if the bones had remembered they were not iron. The beam would strike the ground with a heavy thunk, and the victim would lie there, face pressed into dirt, breathing in grit, tasting the bitterness of the street. And the crowd would jeer. Not all of them, never all. In any crowd, there are a few who go quiet, whose faces tighten as if they are forcing themselves not to feel. But in Rome, the sound that won was the louder sound, the sound of safety purchased by someone else's suffering. At the place of execution, the body was stripped again, because even the last scraps of cloth were considered too generous for those Rome had condemned. Then came the fastening. Sometimes they used ropes, carefully tied, chosen not for speed, but for endurance, designed to keep a person alive longer, to stretch agony across hours. Other times they used iron nails, not delicate spikes, thick metal meant for timber, driven through wrists and feet, splitting flesh with a dull, brutal certainty. The sound of it was unforgettable. Hammer on iron, iron on bone, clank, clank, until the body jerked like a trapped animal and then sagged, suspended in a posture the human form was never meant to hold. The cross was raised. Wood creaked under strain. Ropes tightened. The victim lifted from the ground, arms spread, not like an offering, but like a display. And then the long death began. Not dramatic, not swift, a death that was mostly breath. The body, hanging, pulled downward by its own weight. The chest struggled to expand. Each inhale became labor. Each exhale left a little less strength behind. To draw air, the victim had to push upward, scraping torn feet against wood, lifting their own shattered weight just to widen the lungs. For a while they could do it, and then they could not. Seneca, who witnessed many crucifixions, wrote of what he saw, crosses not of one kind, but many. Bodies hung in different positions, suffering altered and adjusted as if Rome were experimenting with the shape of despair. Executioners were not careless men. They were craftsmen of pain. They developed ways to prolong it. A small seat, like a cruel mercy, could be fixed to the cross. A support that prevented the victim from suffocating too quickly. It did not ease suffering. It extended it. It allowed the body to remain alive long enough for the crowd to tire, to eat, to return, to watch again. Hours, sometimes days. Under the changing sky, the victim would slowly become something else. The voice would fail first, turning from cries into hoarse moans, then into a raw wheeze that barely carried beyond the lips. The head would droop. Flies would gather. The body would tremble in waves, pain, exhaustion, fever, until even trembling became too expensive. And still, Rome called this order. The most infamous mass crucifixion came in 71 BC, after the rebellion of Spartacus was crushed. The rebels were captured, thousands of them, and Rome chose not merely to execute them, but to line them up like punctuation marks along the road. The general Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered approximately 6,000 rebels crucified along the Appian Way, the great road stretching between Rome and Capua. For nearly 200 kilometers, travelers passed them. Not bodies neatly removed, not a graveyard behind walls. Living men dying in public, row after row, each cross a sentence, each scream a repetition of the same lesson. This is what becomes of those who raise arms against Rome. Imagine walking that road, the sun beating down, dust drifting over stone, the smell of sweat and decay carried by the wind. And always, at the edge of vision, the outline of a man hanging, sometimes still moving, sometimes already slack, sometimes begging for water, with a tongue too swollen to form words. Plutarch recorded that the bodies remained until they rotted away. Long after the voices stopped, the warning remained, silent, swinging, dissolving into the air of Italy. Rome did not need to speak. Rome had already written its message in the bodies along the road. Yet crucifixion was for those Rome considered beneath dignity. Slaves, rebels, enemies, the disposable. Rome reserved something different for its own soldiers. Because the empire understood something terrible about armies. A man who fears death may still fight, but a man who fears his own brothers is easier to control. When a legion showed cowardice, mutiny, or catastrophic failure, Rome did not always punish one offender. It punished the unit, not to kill them all. No, that would waste bodies Rome needed, but to tear something inside them and leave it scarred forever. They called it decimation. The word itself came from the Latin, to take a tenth. The method was cold, almost ceremonial. The legion would be divided into groups of 10. Men who had marched together, slept beside one another, shared bread and jokes, and terror in the dark before battle. Then lots were drawn, and in each group, one man, only one, would draw the fatal mark. He did not die by the hand of an executioner. He died by the hands of his 9 companions, the same hands that had once pulled him up a slope, that had once passed him water, that had once clasped his shoulder in victory. Now those hands would become clubs and stones. And the lesson was not only for the dead man, it was for the living. Because after a soldier has helped kill his brother, something in him changes. Something breaks. Something hardens. And Rome counted on that. Because simple death was never enough, not when the real purpose was to make obedience feel like the only way to breathe. In the camp, decimation did not end when the 10th man stopped moving. The dead were only the first layer of the lesson. The survivors, 9 out of 10, were forced to live with the sound of what they had done. The dull cracking of bone beneath stones, the choking, pleading breaths, the moment a friend's eyes stopped recognizing them. And Rome did not allow them to wash it away with honor. They were made to sleep outside the fortifications like strays, exposed to the night wind and the eyes of enemies. They were fed barley instead of wheat, grain fit for animals, not citizens, a daily reminder that their bodies still belonged to Rome, but their dignity did not. The military writer Frontinus noted that legions marked by decimation often became fiercest afterward, fighting as if ferocity could scrub shame from the soul. But shame does not scrub clean. It rots, quietly, and it changes men. The poet Lucan caught the horror with a single cold image, chance becoming the arbiter of doom, death depending not on valor, not on guilt, but on the blind cruelty of a lot. Some soldiers, the records whisper, could not endure it. They chose to end their own lives rather than lift a stone against their comrades. Others swore blood oaths, promising not to survive if the fatal lot fell upon one of their 10. Desperate attempts to preserve something human in a system built to grind the human down. And yet, decimation still offered a sliver of mercy. 9 were spared. For the soldier who failed alone, who abandoned his post, lost his weapons, or showed individual cowardice, Rome devised a punishment with no arithmetic of survival. No 10th, no chance. They called it Fustuarium, the punishment of the clubs. It began as so many Roman lessons began, publicly. The condemned man was brought before the assembled legion. Every face he had lived among, every man who had shared his fire, his bread, his marches through rain and mud, was forced to stand and watch. A tribune approached, not with rage, not with fury, with formality. He would touch the condemned lightly with a cudgel, a small gesture, almost gentle, like the tap of a finger. That touch was the signal. And then the legion fell upon him. Not executioners, not strangers, his own brothers in arms. Clubs rose and fell. Stones struck flesh. The sound was a storm of dull impacts. Thud, crack, thud, until the body became a shape that no longer resembled a man. The purpose was not only to kill him, it was to make every witness complicit. So that, after such a death, the thought of desertion would not feel like freedom, but like stepping toward a cliff while 9 familiar hands closed behind you. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, described the aftermath with chilling clarity. Even if a man escaped the beating, he was not saved. He was not allowed to return home, and no family would dare receive him. Rome could exile a man from life without ever moving him from the soil of Italy. Traitors were cast from the Tarpeian Rock. Rebels were stretched on crosses until breath became impossible. Soldiers were forced to kill brothers or to be killed by them. And still, the empire wasn't satisfied, because there were punishments designed not only to end a life, but to turn death into spectacle, to make the crowd hungry, to make cruelty feel ordinary, even festive. They called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, not for Roman citizens in good standing, not for those whose deaths required symbolic restraint. This was for slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals Rome deemed unworthy of a dignified end. Beneath the Colosseum, beneath the sand where people cheered, ran a shadowed network. Pens, corridors, shafts rising upward like throats. Trapdoors waited underfoot. And at the appointed moment, the earth would open with a wooden groan and a burst of stale animal breath, and the condemned would find themselves in sudden daylight, blinking, stumbling, as the stands erupted. Sometimes these killings were staged as myths. A man might be dressed as Orpheus, handed a lyre, made to play as if music could soften fate. For a heartbeat, the animals might seem still. Then the gates would open. A bear, starved and furious, would surge forward, and the myth would become a grotesque parody, art drowned beneath teeth and muscle. The poet Martial watched and praised such spectacles, marveling at how fable became reality in the arena, how the Romans could take a story and make it bleed. During Trajan's celebration of his Dacian victories in 107 AD, games stretched for 123 days. Thousands of condemned men died. 11,000 animals were slaughtered alongside them. Lions were starved until hunger became madness. Bears were driven into rage with hot irons. And the crowd, drink in hand, cheered not only for death, but for uncertainty. Would the beast kill quickly, or would it toy with its prey? Children watched from shoulders. Vendors moved through the stands with food and wine. People placed bets on how long a victim would scream. And in that sound, the laughter, the shouting, you can hear Rome's deeper triumph, the moment cruelty stops shocking and becomes entertainment. But Rome did not only feed bodies to beasts. Sometimes it fed them to fire, to flames that were treated not as merely destructive, but as purifying, as if certain crimes left a stain so foul only burning could cleanse it. Under Nero, after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, execution by flame became performance. Victims were coated in wax or pitch so they would burn more slowly, more brightly. Their suffering stretched into illumination. Tacitus described the scene. Mockery added to death. Men covered in the skins of beasts, torn by dogs, nailed to crosses, or doomed to the flames to serve as nightly light when daylight had expired. Human torches, their fat crackling, their hair igniting with a soft, sudden woof. The smell of burning flesh drifting through the air, sweet, sickening, impossible to forget. And while they burned, Nero rode among them in his gardens, actor, audience, executioner, watching Rome's terror glow against the dark. It is one of history's bleakest ironies that those gardens, on Vatican Hill, would later become the site of St. Peter's Basilica, a place of martyrdom transformed into Christianity's most sacred ground. Yet even fire, even beasts, were not always enough. Sometimes Rome wanted more than death. It wanted disappearance. It wanted to strike not only the body, but the echo a life leaves behind. Because the most terrifying fate for a Roman was not pain, it was oblivion. And Rome knew how to manufacture it. They called it damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. To Rome, a person was not only flesh, a person was also name, inscription, statue, lineage, the thin thread by which one life might reach beyond death. To be remembered was a kind of second breath. To be forgotten was to die twice. So when the Senate decreed this punishment, it did not simply kill, it unmade. Statues were smashed or recarved into new faces. Names were chiseled from stone until letters became scars. Coins were melted down. Wills were invalidated. Even speaking the condemned person's name could become a crime, as if syllables themselves carried infection. The poet Horace had once expressed a Roman hope, "I shall not wholly die, the faith that works, and memory could outlast the body." Damnatio memoriae was engineered to extinguish that hope. After the assassination of Emperor Domitian in 96 AD, the Senate ordered precisely this. His statues were destroyed or altered. His name was scraped from monuments. His image was hunted down like a fugitive made of marble. And today, the evidence remains, not in what survives, but in what is missing. In the Roman Forum, inscriptions bearing Domitian's name showed deliberate damage, letters gouged away with patient hatred. It is a haunting paradox. We know he was erased because the erasure was so thorough it became visible, absence turning into a kind of presence. And now, we return to where we began, to the river, to the sack, to the denial of sky and earth. Poena, the punishment of the sack, was reserved almost exclusively for those Rome considered the worst kind of traitor, not of state, but of blood. Parricides, those who murdered parents or close kin. For Romans, this was an ultimate violation of pietas, the sacred duty owed to family and ancestors, the moral spine that held the household, and by extension, the republic, together. The ritual had ancient roots in the 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, reaching back to 450 BC. The condemned was beaten with blood-colored rods, then sewn into leather alongside 4 living symbols: the dog, the rooster, the monkey, the viper. Shamelessness, arrogance, malice, venomous hatred, thrown into the Tiber or the sea. No burial, no air, no sun, no earth. Cicero, arguing a famous parricide case, laid out the philosophy with chilling clarity. They wanted the killer of the giver of life to be deprived of the elements from which life itself derives. And there was another cruelty in it, subtle, almost poetic in its darkness. Rome created a new family for the condemned in death, not honored ancestors, not mourning kin, but beasts, thrashing, biting, hissing in the same cramped prison, an eternal companionship of panic and pain. Yet Rome's appetite for control did not end with its own traditions. It adopted horrors from elsewhere, modifying them into instruments of imperial fear. Scaphism, a torture associated with the Persians, was reserved for crimes considered to endanger the community itself: sacrilege against sacred sites, betrayal of military secrets. The condemned was stripped and fastened between two boats or hollowed logs, head and limbs protruding, forced to drink milk and honey until the body rebelled in violent diarrhea. Then honey smeared over exposed skin to call insects, like a summons. Left floating on stagnant water, unable to move, covered in excrement, the victim became a living feast. Flies, beetles, wasps, a constant crawling that never stopped. Day after day. Death could take weeks. Plutarch described the execution of a soldier named Mithridates by this method, noting he survived 17 days before death finally arrived, slow as rot. Sometimes the threat alone was enough. When Emperor Aurelian captured Queen Zenobia of Palmyra after her rebellion in 270 AD, he threatened her with this fate. The queen, famous for defiance, submitted. Comfortable exile suddenly seemed like mercy when measured against insects and weeks of living decay. Fire, in Rome, always carried a double meaning: purifier and destroyer. That duality became another weapon. There was mors per ignem lentum, death by slow fire. Not the quick blaze of a stake that might, in its own brutal way, be merciful. This was careful, controlled. A person could be roasted on a metal grid, suspended above low flames, partially immersed in boiling oil, or enclosed in devices meant to cook the body gradually, as if suffering were a meal Rome insisted on preparing properly. In Lugdunum, modern Lyon, in 157 AD, the Christian martyr Blandina was roasted on an iron chair over carefully regulated flames during public games. Witnesses recorded that she remained conscious and speaking through much of the ordeal, her endurance itself becoming part of the spectacle. The jurist Ulpian classified death by fire as summum supplicium, the ultimate punishment, and recommended it for arsonists, poisoners, practitioners of magic. Crimes Rome believed polluted the world and demanded purification through pain. And perhaps the most psychologically terrifying punishment Rome reserved was not for soldiers, not for rebels, not for criminals in the street, but for sacred women who stood at the heart of Rome's religious identity, the Vestal Virgins. They tended the sacred fire of Vesta, Rome's spiritual heartbeat. Their vows were not personal promises. They were bound to the survival of the state itself. If a Vestal broke her vow, Rome believed it was more than scandal. It was contamination. And Rome could not spill a Vestal's blood without risking divine pollution. So it devised a method that pretended not to kill her at all: live burial. The condemned priestess would be dressed in funeral attire and carried in a covered litter to the Campus Sceleratus, the field of transgression near the Cullei Gate. There, an underground chamber waited, small, suffocating, provisioned with a little food, a little water, a lamp, a bed. A legal fiction. Rome could claim it was not executing her, only placing her somewhere, and letting fate do the rest. Then the entrance was sealed. Stone. Earth. Darkness. No crowd could see what happened after, and perhaps that was the point. The horror was private, an invisible death that forced the imagination to do the screaming. Inside, the Vestal faced a choice: end her life quickly, or endure the slow, lightless erosion of hunger. The most famous victim was Cornelia, chief Vestal condemned by Domitian in 91 AD, despite her protestations of innocence. Pliny the Younger recorded her composure, how she maintained dignity even as she descended to her living tomb. At one moment, her dress caught on the ladder. The executioner offered his hand. Cornelia recoiled, as if, even in her final descent, she refused to be touched, preserving purity as Rome entombed her. She kept calling upon the gods, repeating a line that cuts through time like a whisper trapped in stone. Caesar thinks I am unchaste. I, who performed sacred rites while he triumphed and ruled. Archaeological excavations near the Colline Gate have uncovered small chambers consistent with these descriptions, some containing remains of female skeletons, alongside oil lamps and deteriorated food vessels, echoes of a ritual meant to be both punishment and denial. 12 methods, not accidents, not isolated cruelty, a system. Traitors thrown from cliffs, rebels crucified along Roman roads until the landscape itself became a grave, soldiers forced to beat brothers to death in decimation, cowards clubbed by their own legions in fustuarium, condemned men fed to beasts as lunchtime entertainment, victims burned as human torches to light an emperor's gardens, enemies crushed beneath elephants, lives erased by condemnation of memory, parricides sewn into sacks with animals and thrown into water, spies devoured slowly by insects, bodies roasted over controlled flame, sacred priestesses buried alive in darkness. Seneca once observed that the man who makes punishment his trade strives to find pleasure, not merely in having punished, but in punishing. And perhaps that is Rome's darkest confession. These penalties were never only about blood. They were about control, shaping how citizens thought, feared, obeyed, teaching them that power was not merely strong, but eternal. Today, the Colosseum stands as stone, admired for engineering. Tourists photograph its arches and buy souvenirs where 50,000 once screamed. But walk its tunnels at dusk, when the light thins and the air cools, and imagination begins to do what Rome trained it to do. You can almost hear iron gates creak open, almost hear beasts rumbling behind bars, almost hear condemned feet shuffling on sand already stained brown from other deaths. And then the crowd, one voice made of thousands, rising as a single body, while someone dies for their entertainment. The stone is easy to admire. Harder is remembering its purpose, a cruelty rehearsed until it felt normal. That is the warning carved into ruins. A civilization that glorifies violence eventually crumbles beneath its own applause.